This is the World Organic News for the week ending 19th of February 2018. John Moore reporting. As I discussed last week with the new vision statement for the podcast and blog, decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil in mind, I'm calling on my listeners to put forward ideas for an interview episode once a month. If you know anyone who is doing either part of the vision, I'd love to hear from them. Or indeed from you if you're on the front line doing the work. This week I received a message from a listener, Sam in Uganda, through the Facebook page World Organic News. Thanks for the feedback, Sam, much appreciated. Anyway, his message discussed the recarbonise the soil idea. I was able to send Sam some links, one of which we'll be discussing today. The Wentworth group of concerned scientists was referenced in the late night live discussion with Charles Massey a few episodes back. In this discussion, he referred to a 1% increase in soil carbon over 15% of agricultural land, being sufficient to remove all the extra CO2 added since the start of the Industrial Revolution. This is a terrifyingly simple approach to carbon sequestration, little discussed in climate change circles. The point being, and which Sam raised, is this worldwide agricultural land or just here in the Antipodes? I assumed it meant worldwide, but I went and did some digging. I first came across this idea, as it turns out, back in 2009. There's a link to the landline story from the 15th of February that year in the show notes. The story, entitled Ground Control, is an interview with soil scientist Dr. Christine Jones. The good Dr. Jones has been running trials with direct seeding into summer pastures with winter grains. No tillage, no removal of ground cover. Sow into winter pastures in autumn as they die off, and then harvest the grains as the summer pastures are kicking off their regrowth in spring, and the cereals are ready for harvest. It's also worth remembering that we were across this wide brown land, coming towards the end of the millennium drought in 2009. Not that we were certain at that time, so anything to save soil moisture was a good idea. Here's the statement from Dr. Jones which first piqued my interest. Quote, as bare soil gives its carbon up to the atmosphere, she says the way to build soil carbon and keep it there is 100% ground cover all year round. What we are trying to show is that if people manage land in a way that looks after the ground cover, then the carbon will increase. End quote. Simples, as they say. This fitted nicely with my understanding of the Fukuoka method of natural farming, and one of the key elements of this system is no bare soil. Then referring to carbon measurement schemes going on at the time, quote, she's, that is Dr. Jones, frustrated that scientists and politicians don't see the same opportunity she sees. This year Australia will emit over 600 million tonnes of carbon, and we can sequester 685 million tonnes of carbon by increasing soil carbon by 0.5% on only 2% of the farms. If we increased it on all the farms, we would sequester the whole world's emissions of carbon. End quote. Remember, this was back in the dark ages of 2009. And from that same year, Optimising Carbon in the Australian Landscape, an article from the Wentworth group of concerned scientists, we have the following. Quote, the science now tells us that it will be next to impossible for nations to achieve the scale of reductions required in sufficient time to avoid dangerous climate change unless we remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in vegetation and soils. Terrestrial carbon includes carbon stored in forests, woodlands, swamps, grassland, farmland, soils, and derivatives of these carbon stores, including biochar and biofuels. The power of terrestrial carbon to contribute to the climate change solution is profound. At a global scale, a 15% increase in the world's terrestrial carbon stock would remove the equivalent of all carbon pollution emitted from fossil fuels since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I say again, the power of terrestrial carbon to contribute to the climate change solution is profound. At a global scale, a 15% increase in the world's terrestrial carbon stock would remove the equivalent of all the carbon pollution emitted from fossil fuels since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. End quote. So why isn't this being shouted from the rooftops? Why are we still hearing a carbon tax is the only way forward? Let's run ourselves a thought experiment, shall we? Who benefits from the current plough, spray, harvest, repeat system? Clearly not the farmers. In the US, the number of farmers as a percentage of the population has fallen to a level where farmer is not even an occupation choice in the census there. Let that sink in. So not farmers. Who then benefits from the current industrial farming model? Shareholders of seed, fertiliser and chemical companies, fossil fuel producers, and allegedly consumers. I'll get to consumers momentarily. It turns out, according to the site opensecrets.org, Monsanto alone since 2006 has spent at least $3.6 million annually on reportable lobbying efforts, with at least 4 of those years being double or more than double that amount. And of course, Monsanto is not the only pro-industrial ag lobbyist out there, so the numbers rise. But I hear you ask, do lobbyists actually make a difference to policy? And that's a fair question. Look at the effects of the National Rifle Association's lobbying efforts and the US gun laws to draw your own conclusions. The outcome of the subsidised agricultural system in the US is the production of corn, called maize in other parts of the world, but corn in the US. This corn is now an input to an industrial system which tears apart the grain and utilises every component. Think high fructose corn syrup, corn flour, etc. For more on this, watch the doco King Corn. There's a link in the show notes. So we have at least 3 consequences of the current industrialised agricultural system. Carbon disappearing into the ether, lobbyists perpetuating the system, and health effects from the ubiquity of corn-based products. It is number 3 that should have people up in arms or marching in the streets as much as 1 and 2. Corn is now everywhere, especially in the US. Not just sprinkled on every hamburger bun, but the main food for cattle jammed into feedlots, standing in faeces, and euphemistically called confined animal feeding operations. What this does to the cattle should be reason enough to end these practices. But what they do to humans should also be sufficient. Because the animals are fed the same feed across the feedlots of America, they produce the same bland, tasteless meat, needing to be smothered in sauces to give an illusion of flavour. Surprisingly, or not, these sauces are roughly 50% sugar. Earl Butz, US Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon, and his decision to move from paying farmers to keep land out of production to paying them to overproduce corn as the starting point for the obesity and type 2 diabetes epidemics in the West, and coming to a newly developed nation near you. Subsidising farmers to increase their soil carbon, rather than their corn production, would not only reverse the CO2 accumulated in the atmosphere, it would also lead to healthier populations, but reduced incomes to the shareholders of seed, chemical and fertiliser companies. And of the 3 groups, farmers, consumers and shareholders, can you guess which one is throwing lobbyists cash to maintain the status quo? I think I've made this point before. The inertia of the system will need a rocket under it to effect change, and that change will not come from within the system. On the original question at the start of the episode, 15% of how much land? 15% of agricultural land worldwide will remove the CO2 emitted since the start of the Industrial Revolution. That's something worth pursuing. And with that thought, I'll finish for this week. And remember, decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. If you'd like to learn to podcast, drop over to mrjohnmoore.com and check out my course. I've been teaching this at community colleges around town and have developed an online version for you. There's a link in the show note. The next session starts on the 1st of March this year, and it'd be great to see you there. A transcript of this episode is available at worldorganicnews.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.